In 1940, the conflict in the West shifted dramatically from the phony war into a phase of shock and urgency. This period reveals how Hitler, facing shortages of fuel and weapons, yet eager to defeat Britain, moved from his halted 1939 strategies to two audacious initiatives: the invasions of Denmark and Norway in April to secure iron ore and access to the Atlantic, and after the Mechelin crash unveiled previous plans, Manstein's updated sickle cut through the Ardennes. We'll explore the glider attack on Eben Emael, the Luftwaffe's strikes in the early morning hours, the hurried advance of Allied Plan D into Belgium, the crossings at Sedan and Dinant, and the failures of the French and British command, logistics, and air support. You'll witness the swift downfall of the Dutch after Rotterdam, Belgium in distress, and on the very day the main offensive begins, the fall of Chamberlain and the rise of Churchill in London. By the end, you'll grasp how a winter deadlock transformed into a swift German advance towards the Channel, why Norway occupied crucial forces, and how these actions paved the way for France's imminent downfall. Hitler originally intended for his assault on the Low Countries in France to commence in November 1939, as soon as German divisions could be redeployed from Poland. His primary goal was to capture Channel ports and airfields to launch strikes against Britain, which he considered his greatest adversary. He was in a rush to secure a decisive victory in the West before the United States could intervene. German generals, however, expressed concerns. They feared that the size of the French army might result in another stalemate akin to the First World War. Germany lacked the fuel and resources for a prolonged campaign. Some hesitated to attack neutral Holland and Belgium, but such moral objections, similar to the few protests regarding the SS's execution of Polish civilians, were fiercely dismissed by Hitler. His anger intensified upon learning that the Wehrmacht was critically low on munitions, particularly bombs and tanks. Even the brief campaign in Poland had depleted their supplies and highlighted the inadequacies of the Mark I and Mark II tanks. Hitler attributed this failure to the army's procurement system and swiftly appointed Dr. Fritz Todt, his construction chief, to oversee it. True to his character, Hitler decided to exhaust all raw material reserves without consideration for the future and at the cost of later warfare. He argued that they could be replenished as soon as the Wehrmacht seized the coal and steel regions of the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and Luxembourg. The mists and fogs of late autumn 1939 had already forced Hitler to acknowledge that the Luftwaffe couldn't provide the crucial support needed for his target date in November. Hitler then commanded plans to be made for an invasion of neutral Holland in mid-January 1940. Interestingly, both the Dutch and Belgians received warnings from the Italian Foreign Ministry. Many Italians, especially Mussolini's foreign minister Count Ciano, had grown nervous and angry over Germany's swift move to war in September. They feared they would be the first targets of British attacks in the Mediterranean. Additionally, Oberst Hans Oster, an anti-Nazi in German military intelligence, alerted the Dutch military attaché in Berlin. Then on January 10, 1940, a German liaison plane lost in thick clouds crash-landed in Belgium. The Luftwaffe officer aboard, who had the invasion plans, attempted to burn the documents but was interrupted by Belgian soldiers before all were destroyed. Ironically, this situation turned out to be quite unfortunate for the Allies. Thinking a German invasion was imminent, they quickly moved their forces from northeastern France, which were set to defend Belgium, to the frontier, giving away their own strategy. This prompted Hitler and the OKW to reconsider their plans. The new strategy involved Generalleutnant Erich von Manstein's brilliant idea of launching an attack with panzer divisions through the Ardennes, then advancing toward the Channel behind the British and French armies heading into Belgium. The delays lulled the Allied forces stationed along the French frontiers into a false sense of security, leading many soldiers and even some planners in the War Office to think that Hitler would never have the resolve to invade France. Unlike the senior army commanders, Gross Admiral Raeder fully supported Hitler's aggressive strategy and even urged the Führer to incorporate the invasion of Norway into his plans to create a flank for the German Navy against British shipping. He argued that seizing the northern Norwegian port of Narvik was necessary to secure the crucial supply of Swedish iron ore for Germany's war efforts. He introduced Vidkun Quisling, the pro-Nazi leader in Norway, to Hitler, and Quisling convinced the Führer of the necessity of a German occupation of Norway. The looming threat of British and French intervention to support the Finns troubled him. He feared that if the British established a naval base in southern Norway, they could cut off access to the Baltic. Himmler was also looking at Scandinavia, but primarily as a source for recruiting for his Waffen-SS units. However, Nazi efforts to infiltrate the Scandinavian nations had not been as successful as they had intended. What the Nazis did not realize was that Churchill had originally aimed to do more than just block the Baltic. The assertive First Lord of the Admiralty had planned to send a surface fleet into the Baltic, but fortunately for the Royal Navy, Operation Catherine was halted. Churchill also sought to stop the flow of Swedish ore from Narvik to Germany, but Chamberlain and the War Cabinet opposed violating Norway's neutrality. Churchill then took a calculated gamble. On February 16th, HMS Cossack, a British destroyer, intercepted the supply ship Altmark in Norwegian waters to free British Merchant Navy prisoners aboard. The exhilarating shout from the boarding party, "The Navy's here," captured the attention of a British public weary of the war's inconveniences. In reaction, the Kriegsmarine intensified its operations at sea. Yet, on February 22nd, 2 German destroyers were attacked by Heinkel 111s, as the Luftwaffe had not been informed in time that they were in the area. The destroyers were struck and hit mines, leading to their sinking. Subsequently, German warships were ordered back to port for a different reason. On March 1st, Hitler commanded preparations for the invasion of Denmark and Norway, a mission requiring all available surface ships. This decision alarmed both the German army and the Luftwaffe, who were already grappling with the impending invasion of France. They feared that a distraction in Norway could be catastrophic. Göring was particularly furious, largely out of frustration. He believed he hadn't been adequately consulted beforehand. On March 7th, Hitler approved the directive, which seemed to gain urgency as air reconnaissance indicated that the Royal Navy was gathering its forces at Scapa Flow, likely in preparation for a landing on the Norwegian coast. However, a few days later, news of the Soviet-Finnish agreement to end their conflict stirred mixed feelings within the German high command. Even the Kriegsmarine planners, who had consistently pushed for intervention in Norway, began to believe that the pressure had eased, thinking the British and French no longer had a reason to land in Scandinavia. Yet Hitler and others, including Gross Admiral Raeder, felt that preparations were advanced enough to proceed with the invasion. A German occupation would effectively pressure Sweden to continue supplying iron ore, and Hitler was drawn to the idea of German bases facing Britain's eastern coastline, providing access to the northern Atlantic. The invasion of Norway, involving 6 divisions, and Denmark, with 2 divisions and a motorized rifle brigade, was scheduled for April 9th. Transport ships, escorted by the Kriegsmarine, would disembark forces at various locations, including Narvik, Trondheim, and Bergen. The Luftwaffe's 10th Fliegerkorps would drop paratroopers and air landing units in strategic areas, particularly Oslo. Copenhagen and 7 other significant towns in Denmark would be attacked from both land and sea. The OKW felt they were racing the British for Norway, but in reality, they were well ahead. Chamberlain, oblivious to German plans, had ordered the Anglo-French Expeditionary Force for Norway and Finland to stand down after the Soviet-Finnish Pact was signed, disregarding the advice of General Sir Edmund Ironside, the chief of the Imperial General Staff. Chamberlain, wary of escalating the war to neutral Scandinavia, simply hoped that Germany and the Soviet Union would drift apart. However, the Allies' inaction and naive hopes of waging war within the League of Nations framework were unlikely to convince anyone. Daladier, while still French Prime Minister, had advocated for a much bolder strategy as long as it kept the fighting away from France. Alongside bombing the oil fields in Baku and Mid-Caucasia, a notion that appalled Chamberlain, Daladier also sought to seize the mining region of Petsamo in northern Finland, close to the Soviet naval base in Murmansk. He strongly advocated for landings along the Norwegian coast and complete control of the North Sea to block Swedish iron ore from reaching Germany. However, the British suspected that his true aim was to shift the war focus to Scandinavia, thereby diminishing the likelihood of a German assault on France. This suspicion was partly due to Daladier's stubborn opposition to the British strategy of mining the Rhine to disrupt shipping. Ultimately, Daladier was compelled to resign as Prime Minister on March 20th, with Paul Reynaud stepping into the role and Daladier becoming the Minister for War. The back and forth among the Allies over their competing strategies squandered valuable time. Daladier insisted that Reynaud continue to resist mining the Rhine. The British consented to the French proposal of mining the waters off Narvik, which was executed on April 8th. Churchill wanted to prepare a landing force, convinced the Germans would respond, but Chamberlain remained overly cautious. Unbeknownst to the British, a significant German naval contingent, carrying infantry, had already departed Wilhelmshaven on April 7th, bound for Trondheim and Narvik in northern Norway. The battle cruisers Gneisenau and Scharnhorst were flanked by the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and 14 destroyers, with 4 additional groups heading toward ports in southern Norway. A British aircraft spotted the main task force led by Vice Admiral Günther Lütjens. RAF bombers struck, but not a single hit was recorded. The British Home Fleet, under Admiral Sir Charles Forbes, set sail from Scapa Flow but lagged behind. The only naval power positioned to intercept was the battlecruiser HMS Renown and its escorting destroyers supporting the mining operation off Narvik. One of those destroyers, HMS Glowworm, detected a German destroyer and pursued it, but Lütjens dispatched the Hipper, which sank the Glowworm as it tried to ram her. The Royal Navy, eager to consolidate its forces for a significant naval engagement, ordered troops to disembark from other warships ready to head to Narvik and Trondheim. Yet, the home fleet struggled to successfully intercept the main German task force. This allowed Lütjens time to send his destroyers to Narvik, but at dawn on April 9th, his battle squadron spotted the Renown. The Renown, with its remarkably accurate fire amidst the heavy seas, pounded the Gneisenau and inflicted damage on the Scharnhorst, forcing Lütjens to retreat while his ships conducted emergency repairs. The German destroyers, after sinking 2 small Norwegian warships, landed their troops and took control of Narvik. On the same day, the Hipper and her destroyers also landed troops in Trondheim, while another group captured Bergen. Paratroopers and 2 airlifted infantry battalions took Stavanger. Oslo proved much more challenging, even with the Kriegsmarine deploying the new heavy cruiser Blücher and the pocket battleship Lutzow. Norwegian shore batteries and torpedoes sank the Blücher, and the Lutzow had to pull back after sustaining damage. The next morning at Narvik, 5 British destroyers entered the fjords unnoticed, concealed by heavy snowfall from the offshore U-boat patrols. They surprised 5 German destroyers that were refueling, sinking 2 of them, but soon faced attacks from other German destroyers in the side fjords. 2 Royal Navy destroyers were sunk, and a third was severely damaged. Stuck, the remaining ships had to wait until April 13th, when the battleship HMS Warspite and 9 destroyers arrived to assist and eliminated the rest of the German warships. In further actions along the coast, 2 German cruisers, the Königsberg and the Karlsruhe, were sunk, the former by bombs from carrier-launched skuas, and the latter torpedoed by a submarine. The Lutzow was so severely damaged it had to be towed back to Kiel. Despite some successes for the Royal Navy, they could not halt the transport of over 100,000 German troops to Norway that month. The Germans found the occupation of Denmark even simpler, landing troops in Copenhagen before the shore batteries could respond. Denmark's government felt compelled to accept the terms imposed by Berlin. The Norwegians, however, refused any idea of a peaceful occupation. The king, fleeing Oslo with the government on April 9th, ordered mobilization. Although German forces seized numerous bases swiftly, they soon found themselves isolated until reinforcements arrived in significant numbers. The Royal Navy's decision to disembark troops on April 9th delayed the first Allied troops from setting sail until 2 days later. This situation worsened with an impatient Churchill frequently changing his mind and interfering with operational decisions, frustrating General Ironside and the Royal Navy. Meanwhile, Norwegian troops bravely attacked the German 3rd Mountain Division. However, with German forces already in Narvik and Trondheim, the Allied landings had to occur on their flanks, as a direct assault on the harbors was deemed too risky. It wasn't until April 28th that British troops and 2 battalions of the French Foreign Legion began landing, supported by a Polish brigade. They successfully captured Narvik and destroyed the port, but the Luftwaffe's air dominance doomed the Allied operation. Over the next month, the German offensive in the Low Countries and France forced an evacuation of Allied forces from the northern flank, leading to the surrender of Norwegian troops. The Norwegian royal family and government fled to England to continue the fight. Raeder's fixation on Norway, which he had instilled in Hitler, turned out to be a mixed blessing for Nazi Germany. The army consistently complained that the occupation of Norway held too many troops that would have been better deployed elsewhere. From an Allied perspective, the campaign in Norway was devastating. While the Royal Navy managed to sink half of the Kriegsmarine's destroyers, the overall operation was a poor example of cooperation between the branches. Many senior officers suspected that Churchill's misguided enthusiasm was partly driven by a desire to overshadow the failure of his Dardanelles campaign in the First World War. As Churchill would later privately admit, the blame for the Norway fiasco lay more with him than with Neville Chamberlain. Ironically, this would ultimately lead to Churchill replacing Chamberlain as Prime Minister. Meanwhile, along the French border, the phony war, or drôle de guerre, or Sitzkrieg as the Germans called it, lasted far longer than Hitler had anticipated. He held disdain for the French army and was convinced that Dutch resistance would crumble immediately. All he needed was the right strategy to replace the one that the Belgians had given to the Allies. The highest-ranking army officials were not fond of General von Manstein's bold plan and sought to quash it. However, once Manstein finally had the chance to meet with Hitler, he argued that a German invasion of Holland and Belgium would lure British and French troops away from the Franco-Belgian border. This would allow for a strike through the Ardennes and across the Meuse River toward the Somme estuary and Boulogne. Hitler seized the idea, craving a decisive victory. In his usual fashion, he later claimed it had been his concept from the start. The British Expeditionary Force, initially composed of 4 divisions, had positioned itself along the Belgian border the previous October. By May 1940, this had expanded to 1 armored and 10 infantry divisions under General Lord Gort. Despite commanding a sizable force, Gort had to take orders from the French commander in the northeast, General Alphonse Georges, and the somewhat hesitant French commander-in-chief, General Maurice Gamelin. Unlike during the First World War, there was no unified Allied command. Gort and Georges faced a significant challenge: the Brussels government's stubborn refusal to compromise Belgium's neutrality, even though it was aware of the impending German attack. Consequently, Gort and his neighboring French forces had to remain in place until the invasion began. Meanwhile, the Dutch, who had managed to stay neutral during the First World War, were equally determined not to provoke the Germans by collaborating with the French or the Belgians. Still, they held on to the hope that Allied forces would assist their small and under-equipped army once hostilities commenced. The Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, although sympathetic to the Allies, realized it could do little more than close its border and inform the German invaders that they were breaching its neutrality. There was another critical flaw in French strategy. The Maginot Line only extended from the Swiss border to the southernmost part of the Belgian border, opposite the Ardennes. Neither the French nor the British military staff expected the Germans to make an advance through this densely forested area. The Belgians alerted the French to this potential threat, but the aloof Gamelin dismissed the warning. Renaud, who referred to Gamelin as the nerveless philosopher, wanted him removed, but Daladier, the war minister, insisted on his retention. This indecision permeated all levels of command. Support for the war in France was hardly hidden. German assertions that Britain had coerced the French into battle and then would leave them to handle the brunt of the conflict were particularly damaging. Even General Gamelin and the French General Staff displayed little enthusiasm. The limited advance near Saarbrücken in September was seen as almost insulting to the Poles. France's defensive mindset shaped its military structure, as most tank units, while not technically inferior to German panzers, were poorly trained. Aside from 3 mechanized divisions, one hastily organized under Colonel Charles de Gaulle, French tanks were integrated into infantry units. Both French and British troops lacked effective anti-tank weapons, with the British 2-pounder derisively dubbed a pea-shooter, and their radio systems were rudimentary at best. In a fast-paced conflict, field telephones and landlines offered little assistance. The French Air Force was in dire condition, as General Vuillemin had warned Daladier in 1938 during the Czechoslovak crisis that the Luftwaffe would swiftly obliterate their squadrons. Only slight improvements had been made since that time. Consequently, the French relied heavily on the RF, but Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding opposed sending aircraft to France. Fighter Command's main responsibility was the defense of the United Kingdom, and the French airfields lacked adequate anti-aircraft defenses. Furthermore, neither the RAF nor the French Air Force had trained for close support of ground forces. The Allies had overlooked critical lessons from the Polish campaign, including the Luftwaffe's severe preemptive strikes on airfields and the German army's knack for unexpected armored advances that disoriented defenses. After additional delays, partly due to the Norwegian campaign and unfavorable weather forecasts, the German invasion in the West was finally scheduled. Friday, 10th May, was designated X-Day. Hitler, with his usual bravado, predicted it would be the greatest victory in world history. Thursday, 9th May 1940, was a stunning spring day across much of Northern Europe. A war correspondent noted Belgian soldiers planting pansies around their barracks. Rumors of a German attack circulated, with reports of pontoon bridges being set up near the border, but officials in Brussels dismissed them. Many believed Hitler was planning to move south into the Balkans rather than westward. Few imagined he would invade 4 countries, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France, all at once. Life in Paris carried on as normal. The city had seldom appeared so lovely. The chestnut trees had just blossomed, cafes were bustling, and without any hint of irony, J'attendrai remained the popular song. Races continued at Auteuil, and fashionable women filled the Ritz. The sight of numerous officers and soldiers in the streets was especially striking. General Gamelin had recently reinstated leave for the troops. Coincidentally, that morning, Prime Minister Paul Reynaud had submitted his resignation to President Albert Lebrun, as Daladier once again refused to dismiss the commander-in-chief. In Britain, the BBC reported that the previous night, 33 Conservatives had voted against Chamberlain's government in the House of Commons, following a discussion about the mishap in Norway. Leo Amery's speech criticizing Chamberlain would ultimately be disastrous for the Prime Minister. He concluded with Cromwell's famous dismissal of the Long Parliament in 1653. "Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go." Amid uproar with shouts of "Go, go, go," an unsettled Chamberlain exited the chamber trying to hide his feelings. Throughout that sunny day, politicians in Westminster and the clubs of St. James's debated the next move in either soft whispers or heated exchanges. Speculation swirled about who would take over for Chamberlain, Churchill or Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary. For many Conservatives, Edward Halifax seemed the obvious choice. A significant number still regarded Churchill as a dangerous, unpredictable figure. Yet Chamberlain attempted to cling to power. He reached out to the Labour Party, proposing a coalition, but they firmly stated they wouldn't serve under his leadership. That evening, he had to confront the reality of his resignation. Thus, Britain found itself in a political standstill right before the impending German offensive in the West. In Berlin, Hitler prepared his proclamation for the next day, addressing the armies on the Western Front. "The battle that begins today will determine the destiny of Germany for the next 1,000 years," it was declared. As the moment drew near, the Führer became increasingly hopeful, especially following the Norwegian campaign's success. He anticipated France's capitulation within 6 weeks. What thrilled him most was the bold glider attack on the key Belgian fortress of Eben Emmel, close to the Dutch border. That afternoon, his special armored train, America, set off to a new Führer headquarters called the Felsennest, nestled in the wooded hills of the Eifel near the Ardennes. At 9 o'clock, the code word Danzig was transmitted to all army groups. Weather reports confirmed that the following day would offer perfect visibility for the Luftwaffe. Secrecy had been so effectively upheld that despite numerous delays in the attack schedule, some officers were away from their units when the orders to move arrived. In the north, positioned along the Rhine, the German 18th Army was poised to advance into Holland toward Amsterdam and Rotterdam. A third contingent would travel north of Tilburg and Breda toward the coast. Just south of them was Generaloberst Walther von Reichenau's 6th Army, targeting Antwerp and Brussels. Generaloberst von Rundstedt's Army Group A, boasting 44 divisions, housed the main panzer forces. Generaloberst Günther von Kluge's 4th Army was ready to move into Belgium toward Charleroi and Dinant. The coordinated push by these armies into the Low Countries would compel the British and French forces to rush northward to connect with the Belgians and Dutch. At that juncture, Manstein's Siegelschnitt plan would be activated. Generaloberst Wilhelm List's 12th Army would progress across northern Luxembourg and the Belgian Ardennes to cross the river Meuse, south of Givet and near Sedan, the site of France's significant defeat in 1870. Once over the Meuse, the Panzer Group under General de Cavalerie Ewald von Kleist would proceed to Amiens, Abbeville, and the Somme estuary along the Channel. This maneuver would isolate the British Expeditionary Force and the French 7th, 1st, and 9th Armies. Concurrently, the German 16th Army would advance through southern Luxembourg to safeguard Kleist's vulnerable left flank. Generaloberst Ritter von Leeb's Army Group C, along with 2 additional armies, would keep up the pressure on the Maginot Line to the south. This strategy aimed to make the French feel like they couldn't send forces north to rescue their troops trapped in Flanders. Manstein's left hook offensive was actually a reversal of the right hook Schlieffen plan that had been attempted back in 1914, a move the French were anticipating. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris of the Abwehr conducted a highly effective disinformation campaign, spreading rumors throughout Belgium and beyond that this was indeed the Germans' plan. Manstein believed that Gamelin would dispatch most of his mobile troops into Belgium, especially since they had quickly moved towards the border after capturing documents from the plane crash. Many senior Allied officers later thought that the crash had been a clever German ruse, though it was simply an accident, as evidenced by Hitler's rage at the time. Nonetheless, Manstein's strategy to lure the Allies into Belgium played into another French concern. General Gamelin, like many of his fellow countrymen, preferred to engage the enemy on Belgian soil rather than in French Flanders, which had already endured much devastation during the First World War. Hitler was also eager for airborne troops and special forces to contribute to the efforts. He had called Generalleutnant Kurt Student to the Reichschancellery the previous October and instructed him to prepare teams to capture the fortress of Eben-Emael and key bridges along the Albert Canal using glider assault units. Brandenburger commandos, disguised in Dutch uniforms, were tasked with securing bridges, while others, posing as tourists, would infiltrate Luxembourg just ahead of the offensive. However, the main airborne initiative would focus on an assault on 3 airfields around The Hague, involving units from the 7th Fallschirmjäger Division and the 22nd Luftlande Division, led by General Major Hans Graf von Sponeck. Their goal was to seize the Dutch capital and capture the government and royal family members. The Germans created a lot of diversionary activity, spreading rumors about a buildup in Holland and Belgium, attacks on the Maginot Line, and even suggesting a potential breach of Swiss neutrality. Gamelin was convinced that the Germans' attack on Holland and Belgium would be their primary offensive. He overlooked the area facing the Ardennes, believing its dense wooded hills to be impenetrable. The roads and forest paths were wide enough for the German tanks, while the canopy of beech, fir, and oak offered ideal cover for Kleist's panzer group. Generaloberst von Rundstedt had been informed by the photo reconnaissance expert at his headquarters that the French defensive positions along the Meuse were far from complete. Unlike the Luftwaffe, which consistently conducted photo reconnaissance flights over the Allied lines, the French Air Force refrained from sending aircraft over German territory. Nonetheless, Gamelin's military intelligence, the Deuxième Bureau, had a surprisingly accurate understanding of the German order of battle. They had identified most of the panzer divisions in the Eifel, just beyond the Ardennes, and had noted that the Germans were focused on the routes from Sedan to Abbeville. The French military attaché in Bern, alerted by the efficient Swiss intelligence service, warned Gamelin's headquarters on April 30th that an attack was expected between May 8th and 10th, with Sedan being the principal axis of advance. Still, Gamelin and other senior French commanders remained in denial about the threat, maintaining the belief that France is not Poland. General Charles Hunziker, in command of the Second Army responsible for the Sedan sector, had merely 3 substandard divisions at that location. He understood how ill-prepared and unmotivated his reservists were for battle. Hunziker pleaded with Gamelin for 4 additional divisions, as his defenses were not ready, but Gamelin declined. Some accounts suggest that Hunziker was complacent, noting that General André Korap, commanding the neighboring Ninth Army, had a clearer understanding of the danger. Regardless, the concrete positions overlooking the River Meuse, constructed by civilian contractors, lacked embrasures pointing in the correct direction. Minefields and barbed wire defenses were utterly insufficient, and proposals to fell trees across the forest paths on the river's eastern bank were dismissed due to potential cavalry movements. In the early hours of Friday, May 10th, news of the impending attack reached Brussels. Telephones began ringing throughout the city as police hurried from hotel to hotel, instructing night porters to awaken any military personnel staying there. Officers, still struggling to get into their uniforms, hurried off to find taxis to rejoin their regiments or headquarters. As dawn broke, the Luftwaffe appeared. Belgian biplane fighters took to the skies to intercept, but their outdated aircraft stood no chance. Civilians in Brussels woke to the sound of anti-aircraft fire. Earlier that morning, reports of enemy movement had reached Gamelin's headquarters, but they were shrugged off as another overreaction after numerous false alarms. The commander-in-chief wasn't roused until 6:30. His Grand Quartier Général, located in the medieval fortress of Vincennes on the edge of Paris, was distant from the battlefield, yet close to the center of power. Gamelin was a soldier skilled in navigating the intricate politics of the Third Republic. Unlike the fiercely right-wing General Maxime Weygand, whom he had succeeded in 1935, Gamelin had avoided developing an anti-republican image. Credited with orchestrating the Battle of the Marne in 1914 as a talented young staff officer, he was now a small, meticulous man of 68, dressed in impeccably tailored breeches. Many noted his surprisingly weak handshake. He enjoyed an elite atmosphere with his favorite staff officers who shared his intellectual passions, discussing art, philosophy, and literature as if they were performers in a sophisticated French play, detached from reality. Since Gamelin didn't trust radio communications, having none, the orders to prepare for an advance into Belgium were relayed by telephone. That morning, the French commander-in-chief radiated confidence, believing that the Germans were falling into his trap. A staff officer spotted him humming a martial tune while pacing the corridors. News of the attack had also reached London. A cabinet minister visited Winston Churchill at the Admiralty at 6, finding him enjoying a cigar along with eggs and bacon. Churchill was waiting for updates on Chamberlain's discussions. Chamberlain, along with the king and several conservative elites, preferred Lord Halifax to succeed him if necessary. However, Halifax, having a strong sense of public duty, believed Churchill would be a more effective war leader and declined the premiership. Churchill also pointed out that Halifax, being a member of the House of Lords, couldn't effectively lead the government from outside the Commons. On that day in Britain, the unfolding political drama eclipsed the much graver happenings across the English Channel. Gamelin envisioned that General Henry Giraud's 7th Army, positioned on the far left, would move quickly up the coast past Antwerp to link up with the Dutch forces near Breda. This maneuver would play a pivotal role in the impending catastrophe, as the 7th Army represented Gamelin's lone reserve in northeastern France. The Dutch had anticipated more support, but that was an unrealistic expectation, considering their failure to coordinate strategies and the considerable distance from the French border. Gamelin's so-called Plan D proposed that a Belgian force of 22 divisions would guard the River Dyle from Antwerp to Louvain. The British Expeditionary Force, consisting of 9 infantry and 1 armored division, would anchor the right side, securing the Dyle from Louvain to Wavre. On the southern flank, General Georges Blanchard's 1st French Army was tasked with covering the gap between Wavre and Namur, while General Corrap's 9th Army would stretch along the Meuse River from Namur down to west of Sedan. The Germans were well informed, having easily deciphered French communication codes. Gamelin had believed that the Belgian troops defending the Albert Canal would hold back the Germans long enough for the Allies to reach what they thought were pre-established positions. While the Dyle plan seemed reasonable on paper, it utterly underestimated the speed, brutality, and cunning of the Wehrmacht's coordinated attacks. The lessons learned from the Polish campaign had simply gone unheeded. Once more, the Luftwaffe launched preemptive strikes at dawn, targeting airfields in Holland, Belgium, and France. Messerschmitts attacked French planes parked for dispersion, leaving Polish pilots stunned by the French lack of urgency and enthusiasm to confront the enemy. RF squadrons were ordered into action, yet once airborne, they found themselves unsure of their next steps. With ineffective radar systems, ground control offered little assistance. Nevertheless, on that initial day, RAF Hurricane successfully downed over 30 German bombers, though they faced no German fighter escorts at that time, a miscalculation the Luftwaffe would not repeat. The most courageous pilots were those flying the outdated Fairey battle light bombers, tasked with striking a German column moving through Luxembourg. Slow and poorly equipped, they were alarmingly exposed to both enemy fighters and ground fire. 13 out of 32 were shot down, and the rest sustained damage. On that day, the French lost 56 aircraft out of 879, while the RAF saw 49 out of 384 lost. The Dutch Air Force suffered a significant blow, losing half its strength in just the morning. Yet, the clash was not entirely one-sided. The Luftwaffe recorded the loss of 126 aircraft, primarily Junkers 52 transports. The bulk of their efforts focused on Holland, aiming to quickly eliminate the country from the conflict and to create the illusion that the main assault was coming from the north. This strategy was what military analyst Basil Little-Hart would later term the Matador's cloak tactic, designed to lure Gamelin's mobile forces into a trap. In a new twist in warfare, Junkers 52 transports, under the escort of Messerschmitts, began deploying airborne assault troops. However, the main goal of capturing The Hague, with units from the 7th Fallschirmjäger and the 22nd Luftlande divisions, ended up being a costly failure. Many of the slow transports were shot down on the way to their target, and less than half of the troops made it to the 3 airfields around the Dutch capital. Dutch forces fought back fiercely, inflicting significant casualties on the paratroopers, while both the royal family and government managed to escape. Other units from the same 2 divisions managed to capture the Walhaven airfield near Rotterdam and key bridges. However, to the east, Dutch troops acted swiftly, destroying the bridges around Maastricht before German commandos, disguised in Dutch uniforms, could take control. At Felsenest, Hitler is said to have wept tears of joy upon hearing that the Allies were moving into the trap set in Belgium. He was equally ecstatic that the assault group of paratroopers and gliders had successfully landed right on the glacis of the Ibn Email fortress, located at the meeting point of the Meuse and Albert Canal. This maneuver trapped the large Belgian garrison until the 6th Army arrived the next evening. Other detachments of paratroopers captured bridges over the Albert Canal, allowing the Germans to quickly break through the initial lines of defense. Even though the primary airborne operation against The Hague had not succeeded, the deployment of paratroopers deep into Holland sowed widespread panic and chaos. The wild rumors began to circulate about paratroopers landing in nuns' attire, poisoned candies for children, and fifth columnists signaling from attic windows, a phenomenon that spread through Belgium, France, and later reached Britain. On May 10th, the War Cabinet in London convened 3 times. Chamberlain initially wished to remain as Prime Minister, believing that no government changes should occur while the battle raged across the Channel. However, Upon learning that the Labour Party would not support him, he realized he had to resign. Halifax once again declined the premiership, leading Chamberlain to Buckingham Palace to suggest that King George VI request Churchill's leadership. The king, disheartened that Halifax had refused the role, saw no other choice. With Churchill now in position, he quickly redirected his focus to the war and the British Expeditionary Force's advance into Belgium. The 12th Royal Lancers set out first in their armored cars at 10:20 as a reconnaissance screen, with most British units following throughout the day. The 3rd Division's leading column was stopped at the border by a clueless Belgian official asking for a permit to enter. A truck simply smashed through the barrier. Columns of military vehicles filled almost every road heading north to the River Dyle, which the 12th Lancers reached by 6 o'clock in the evening. Initially, the Luftwaffe concentrated on airfields and then on Holland, sparing the Allied armies advancing into Belgium from air attacks. The French, however, were slower to mobilize, with many formations not moving until evening, a serious error as roads quickly became congested with refugees heading the opposite way. In contrast, their 7th Army rushed along the Channel coast towards Antwerp, but soon faced intense Luftwaffe assaults once they arrived in southern Holland. On that hot day, Belgians poured out from cafes to offer mugs of beer to the weary soldiers, a kind gesture not universally appreciated by the officers and non-commissioned officers. As dusk fell, other British units moved through Brussels. An observer noted, the Belgians cheered, and the men in the trucks and Bren carriers waved back. Each soldier wore lilac purple on their steel helmets and on the barrels of their rifles, tucked into their web equipment. They smiled and gave thumbs up, a gesture that initially baffled the Belgians, who saw it as quite rude, but soon recognized it as a sign of bright confidence. It was a moving scene, one that could almost bring tears. As this military force advanced powerfully and quietly, with British military police directing them at every intersection as if they were managing rush hour in London. However, the major battle was set to unfold further southeast in the Ardennes, with Rundstedt's Army Group A. His massive vehicle columns twisted through the forests, shielded from Allied aircraft. Above, a squadron of Messerschmitt fighters patrolled, ready to intercept enemy bombers or reconnaissance planes. Any vehicle that broke down was swiftly cleared from the road. The schedule was strictly followed, and despite concerns from many staff officers, the operation ran smoother than expected. Every vehicle in Panzer Group Kleist bore a small white K on the front and back for priority access. Marching infantry and other transport had to yield the road whenever they appeared. At 4:30 in the morning, General der Panzertruppen Heinz Guderian, commanding the 19th Corps, accompanied the 1st Panzer Division as it crossed into Luxembourg. Brandenburger commandos had already secured key crossroads and bridges. Luxembourg gendarmes could do little more than note the Wehrmacht's violation of their neutrality before being captured. The Grand Duke and his family managed to flee just in time, unnoticed by the Brandenburgers. To the north, 41 Panzer Corps moved toward the Meuse at Monthermé, while further north, General der Panzertruppen Hermann Hoth's 15th Corps, led by General Major Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, progressed toward Dinant. However, several panzer divisions faced delays due to bridges demolished by Belgian sappers from the Chasseurs d'Ardennes. At dawn on May 11th, Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, with the 5th Panzer Division behind and to its right, surged forward again, reaching the River Ourthe. The French cavalry managed to destroy the bridge just in time, then fell back after a quick exchange of fire. Divisional pioneers promptly built a pontoon bridge, and the advance toward the Meuse continued. Rommel observed that during his division's encounters with the French, the Germans had the advantage when they opened fire with everything at once. To the south, Generalleutnant Georg-Hans Reinhardt's 41 Panzer Corps, making their way towards Bastogne and then Monthermé, faced delays from part of Guderian's forces blocking their path. Guderian's 19th Corps, too, experienced confusion due to changes in orders. Meanwhile, the French cavalry screen, made up of mounted units and light tanks, was also in chaos. Despite the increasing strength of the German advance towards the Meuse, the French Air Force did not launch any sorties. The RF sent in 8 more ferry battles, but 7 were lost, primarily to ground fire. Allied aircraft targeting the Maastricht and Albert Canal bridges to the northwest faced heavy losses as well, but their efforts were too late to make a difference. By this time, the German 18th Army had penetrated deep into Dutch territory, where resistance was weakening. Reichenau's 6th Army crossed the Albert Canal, bypassing Liège, while another corps moved toward Antwerp. The British Expeditionary Force, now along the alarmingly narrow River Dyle, and the French forces taking their positions received little attention from the Luftwaffe. This raised concerns among some observant officers who feared they might be led into a trap. The pressing issue, however, was the slow advancement of the French First Army, made even worse by an increasing wave of Belgian refugees. The scenes in Brussels suggested many more were on the way. People were walking, riding in cars, carts, and on donkeys, being pushed in bath chairs or even in wheelbarrows. There were youths on bicycles, old men and women, babies, peasant women with kerchiefs on their heads, riding on farm carts loaded with mattresses, furniture, and pots. A long line of nuns, their faces flushed with sweat under their coifs, stirred up dust with their long gray robes. The stations resembled sketches from revolutionary Russia, with people sleeping on floors, huddled against walls, women with crying babies, and men looking pale and worn out. On May 12th, newspapers in both Paris and London suggested that the German offensive had been stopped. The Sunday Chronicle proclaimed despair in Berlin. Yet, German forces had crossed through Holland to the sea, and what remained of the Dutch army had retreated into the triangle of Amsterdam, Utrecht, and Rotterdam. General Giraud's 7th Army, now in southern Holland, faced relentless attacks from the Luftwaffe. In Belgium, General René Prieux's cavalry corps, serving as the advance guard for the delayed First Army, successfully pushed back the overstretched German panzer units encroaching on the Dyle line. However, Allied squadrons aimed at bombing bridges and troop columns were heavily targeted by German light flak units with their 4-barreled 20mm guns. Despite some dissatisfaction among German forces struggling to cross the Meuse, German broadcasts focused solely on the battles taking place in Holland and northern Belgium, deliberately downplaying the main offensive in the south. Gamelin continued to dismiss the threat to the upper Meuse, ignoring multiple warnings. Meanwhile, General Alphonse Georges, the commander-in-chief of the Northeastern Front, a somber general highly regarded by Churchill, stepped in to prioritize air support for Hunziker's sector around Sedan. Georges, loathed by Gamelin, had not fully recovered from severe chest wounds received in 1934 from the assassin of King Alexander of Yugoslavia. The situation was worsened by the chaotic chain of command within the French army, largely orchestrated by Gamelin to weaken his deputy's standing. Yet even Georges responded to the danger too late. French units northeast of the Meuse retreated across the river, with some doing so in disarray. Guderian's 1st Panzer Division entered Sedan with little resistance. The retreating French forces managed to destroy the bridges at Sedan, but German pioneer bridging crews displayed remarkable speed and efficiency. Later that afternoon, Rommel's 7th Panzer Division reached the Meuse downstream near Dinant. Although the Belgian rearguard blew up the main bridge, grenadiers from the 5th Panzer Division found an old weir at Hoo. Hidden by a thick river mist that night, several companies successfully crossed and secured a bridgehead. Korap's 9th Army could not deploy troops in time to defend the area. On May 13th, Rommel's forces started to cross the Meuse at 2 additional points, but faced intense fire from well-positioned French regulars. Rommel arrived at the crossings near Dinant in his 8-wheeled armored car to evaluate the situation. Discovering that his armored vehicles lacked smoke shells, he instructed his men to ignite some houses upwind of the crossing site. He then deployed heavier Mark IV panzers to fire across the river at the French positions, providing cover for the infantry in their heavy rubber assault boats. An officer from the 7th Panzer's Reconnaissance Battalion recalled, "As soon as the first boats hit the water, chaos erupted. Snipers and heavy artillery targeted the helpless men in the boats. We attempted to neutralize the enemy with our tanks and artillery, but they were too well concealed. The infantry assault stalled." This day marked the rise of the Rommel legend. To his officers, it seemed he was everywhere, directing fire from atop tanks, accompanying the combat pioneers, and crossing the river himself. His energy and courage inspired his men to keep pushing forward when the attack could have faltered. At one point, he took command of an infantry battalion at the Moose when French tanks appeared. Legend has it that Rommel ordered his men, armed only with signal flares, to fire them at the French tanks. The French crews, believing they were being shot at with armor-piercing shells, quickly retreated. German losses were substantial, but by evening, Rommel had established two bridgeheads, one at Hoo and another at the fiercely contested crossing at Dinant. That night, his pioneers constructed pontoon bridges to transport the tanks across. Meanwhile, Guderian, preparing for his own crossings near Sedan, had engaged in a heated argument with his superior, General Oberst von Kleist. He decided to defy orders and managed to convince the Luftwaffe to back his plan with a massive aerial assault from the 2nd and 8th Fliegerkorps. The latter was led by General Major Wolfram Freiherr von Richthofen, a younger cousin of the famous First World War pilot known as the Red Baron, and former commander of the Condor Legion that decimated Guernica. Richthofen's Stukas, diving with their signature Jericho trumpets, would demoralize the French forces defending Sedan. Surprisingly, the French artillery, which had plenty of German vehicles and troops in their sights, had been instructed to hold back their fire to conserve ammunition. The divisional commander anticipated the Germans would take an additional 2 days to get their field guns into position before crossing the river. He had yet to grasp that the Stukas had become the aerial artillery supporting the panzer advance, striking his gun positions with astonishing precision. As Sedan burned fiercely from relentless shelling and bombing, the Germans hurried across the river in heavy rubber boats, paddling with intensity. They faced heavy losses, but eventually, assault pioneers made it across and began attacking the concrete bunkers using flamethrowers and satchel charges. As dusk approached, a frantic rumor spread among the frightened French reservists that enemy tanks had already crossed the river and that they were about to be encircled. Communication among the units and their commanders had nearly collapsed, severed by the bombs destroying the field phone lines. First, the French artillery retreated, followed by the divisional commander himself. A sense of desperation took hold. The ammunition, which had been stockpiled for another day, fell to the enemy without resistance. The older reservists, known as crocodiles, who had survived the First World War, did not want to perish now in what they viewed as an unjust fight. Many had been influenced by the anti-war writings of the French Communist Party, but the most compelling propaganda was the German claim that the British had led them into this war. Renault's assurance to the London government in March that France would never negotiate a separate peace with Germany only fueled their distrust. The French generals, with their mindset shaped by the great victory of 1918, found themselves completely overwhelmed by the unfolding events. General Gamelin, during his visit to General George's headquarters that day, still anticipated the main attack would come through Belgium. It was only in the evening that he realized the Germans had crossed the Meuse. He ordered Hunziker's Second Army to mount a counteroffensive, but by the time the general had repositioned his troops, it was too late for anything more than localized attacks. In truth, Hunziker had misjudged Guderian's intentions entirely. He believed the breakthrough aimed to strike south and assault the Maginot Line from behind, leading him to bolster his forces on the right, while Guderian advanced through his weaker left flank. The fall of Sedan, echoing Napoleon III's surrender in 1870, instilled dread in the hearts of the French commanders. In the early hours of May 14th, Captain André Beaufort, alongside General Dumenc, arrived at General George's headquarters. Beaufort later recalled the atmosphere as somber, like a family mourning a loss. Georges informed them, "Our front has broken at Sedan. There's been a collapse." Overcome with emotion, the weary general slumped into a chair and wept. With 3 German bridgeheads now established around Sedan, Dinant, and a smaller one near Monthermé, Reinhardt's XLI Panzer Corps was catching up after fierce fighting. A gap nearly 80 kilometers wide was about to emerge in the French front. If the French commanders had acted more swiftly, they might have had a chance to crush the German advances. In the Sedan area, General Pierre Lafontaine of the 55th Division had received 2 additional infantry regiments and 2 battalions of light tanks, yet he waited 9 hours to issue orders for a counterattack. The tank battalions faced delays from panicked soldiers of the 51st Division blocking the roads, compounded by poor communication. The Germans seized the night to move more panzers across the Meuse. When the French tanks finally engaged in the early morning, most were quickly destroyed. The collapse of the 51st Division sparked panic in the surrounding units. That morning, Allied air forces deployed 152 bombers and 250 fighters to target the pontoon bridges over the Meuse, but the small targets proved hard to hit, while Luftwaffe Messerschmitt squadrons and lethal German flak wreaked havoc. The RAF faced its worst losses ever, with 40 of 71 bombers shot down. In desperation, the French sent in outdated bombers, which were quickly annihilated. Georges then ordered an untried armored division and a motorized infantry division led by General Jean Flavigny, but they were hampered by fuel shortages. Flavigny was instructed to attack the Sedan bridgehead from the south, as Georges, like Hunziker, believed the primary threat lay on the right. Another counterattack was mounted to the north by the 1st Armored Division against Rommel's bridgehead, but once again, delays proved disastrous due to blocked roads from Belgian refugees and fuel supply vehicles unable to get through. The following morning, on May 15th, Rommel's leading forces caught the division's heavy B-1 tanks off guard while they were refueling. A chaotic battle ensued, placing the French tank crews at a serious disadvantage. Rommel left the 5th Panzer Division to continue fighting while he pressed forward. Had the French tanks been prepared, they could have achieved a significant victory. However, by the end of the day, despite the French 1st Armored Division destroying nearly 100 German tanks, it was nearly wiped out, primarily due to German anti-tank artillery. The Allied forces in the Low Countries remained unaware of the danger looming behind them. On May 13th, General Prieux's cavalry corps carried out a determined retreat to the Dial line, where the rest of Blanchard's 1st Army was taking position. While Prieux's Somme tanks were well armored, the Germans excelled in both shooting and maneuvering, and the absence of radios in the French tanks was a significant setback. After sustaining significant losses in a brave fight, Prieux's corps was withdrawn, unable to press an attack southeast toward the Ardennes breach as Gamelin had hoped. The French 7th Army began pulling back toward Antwerp after an unsuccessful attempt to link up with the stranded Dutch forces in Breda. Though poorly trained and inadequately equipped, the Dutch troops showed great bravery against the advancing 9th Panzer Division pushing toward Rotterdam. The commander of the German 18th Army was frustrated by their tenacity, but by that evening, the panzers finally broke through. The following day, the Dutch entered into negotiations for Rotterdam's surrender, but the German commander failed to notify the Luftwaffe. A large bombing raid was launched on the city, resulting in the deaths of over 800 civilians. The Dutch foreign minister claimed that night that 30,000 had perished, a statement that shocked Paris and London. In light of this, General Henry Winkelmann, the Dutch commander-in-chief, opted for a general surrender to prevent further casualties. Upon hearing the news, Hitler ordered a celebratory march through Amsterdam with units from the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and the 9th Panzer Division. He felt both amused and irritated when he received a telegram from the former Kaiser Wilhelm II, who remained in exile in Apeldoorn. It read, "My Führer, I congratulate you and hope that under your remarkable leadership, the German monarchy will be fully restored." Hitler was taken aback that the former Kaiser expected him to take on the role of Bismarck. "What a fool," he remarked to his valet, Linge. The French planned a counterattack on the eastern section of the Sedan salient for May 14th, but General Flavigny, commander of 21st Corps, first postponed it and then ultimately canceled it. He made the poor choice to divide the 3rd Armored Division to establish a defensive line between Chemery and Stone. Meanwhile, Hunziker was still convinced that the Germans were moving south behind the Maginot Line, so he adjusted his army's position to block that route. Unfortunately, this only opened up a path to the west. Upon hearing about the French reinforcements, General von Kleist told Guderian to halt until additional forces could secure that flank. After a heated discussion, Guderian persuaded him to allow the advance with the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions, while sending the 10th Panzer Division and the Grossdeutschland Infantry Regiment under Graf von Schwerin to attack the strategically positioned village of Stan. On the morning of May 15th, the Grossdeutschland launched the assault without waiting for the 10th Panzer. Flavigny's tank crews fought back fiercely, leading to several changes of hands in the village throughout the day, with both sides suffering heavy losses. In the village's narrow streets, the Grossdeutschland anti-tank units eventually took out the heavy B-1 tanks, and the weary German infantry were bolstered by Panzer Grenadiers from the 10th Panzer. The Grossdeutschland faced its heaviest losses of the campaign, with 103 men killed and 459 wounded. General Korapp began withdrawing his 9th Army, but this move led to a rapid collapse and further widened the gap. Reinhardt's Panzer Corps, now caught up with the other 2 divisions on May 15th, significantly outpaced them, with the 6th Panzer Division advancing 60 kilometers to Montcornet, effectively splitting the beleaguered French 2nd Armored Division. This deep incursion into the French rear prompted General Robert Touchon, who was trying to form a new 6th Army, to close the gap. To realize it was too late, he ordered his forces to retreat south of the river Aisne. Soon, very few French troops remained between the German panzers and the Channel coast. Guderian had been instructed to hold off advancing until enough infantry divisions were moved across the Meuse. All his superiors, Kleist, Rundstedt, and Halder, were very anxious about an overextended panzer advance that was exposed to a significant French counterattack from the south. Even Hitler had concerns about the associated risks. However, Guderian perceived that the French forces were in disarray. The opportunity was too valuable to overlook. What has often been mischaracterized as a blitzkrieg strategy was largely improvised on the scene. The German spearheads surged forward, their reconnaissance units racing ahead in 8-wheeled armored cars and motorcycles with sidecars. They captured bridges that the French hadn't had time to destroy. The panzer crews, dressed in black uniforms, were grimy, unshaven, and completely worn out. Rommel gave the 7th and 5th Panzer Divisions barely any time to rest or maintain their vehicles. Most of the soldiers relied on Pervitin tablets and the intoxicating thrill of overwhelming victory. Any French troops they encountered were so shocked that they surrendered immediately. They were ordered to drop their weapons and keep going, allowing the German infantry that followed to handle them. The second wave trailing closely behind the panzer divisions consisted of motorized infantry. Alexander Stahlberg, then a lieutenant with the 2nd Motorized Infantry Division and later Manstein's aide-de-camp, witnessed the wreckage of a defeated French army. Bullet-riddled vehicles, battered and burned-out tanks, abandoned guns, an endless trail of destruction. They moved through deserted villages, advancing with as little fear of encountering a real enemy as they had during training exercises. Far behind them, infantry marched on foot, their jackboots scorching, driven by their officers to keep pace. Marching, marching. Always further, always towards the west, one soldier noted in his diary. Even their horses were utterly spent. If Hitler had had his way the previous autumn, the invasion of France would likely have ended in disaster. The victory at Sedan was truly a miraculous turn for the German army, which was facing ammunition shortages. The Luftwaffe had enough bombs for just 14 days of combat. Furthermore, the motorized and panzer divisions would have found themselves in a precarious position. The heavier tanks, Mark IIIs and Mark IVs, capable of engaging French and British tanks, simply weren't available at that time, and the urgent need for training, particularly for officers in an army that expanded from 100,000 to 5,500,000, necessitated those additional months. The repeated delays of Operation Yellow had given the Wehrmacht enough time to restore its forces and ready themselves adequately. On May 14th, in London, the War Cabinet had a vague understanding of the circumstances west of the Meuse. Coincidentally, that same day, Anthony Eden, the War Secretary, announced the formation of the Local Defense Volunteer Corps, which would soon be called the Home Guard. In just under a week, about 250,000 men had signed up. However, it wasn't until Renault sent a message from Paris that afternoon that Churchill's government began to grasp the severity of the situation. He asked for 10 more fighter squadrons from Britain to shield his troops from Stuka assaults, acknowledging that the Germans had breached defenses south of Sedan and were likely advancing toward Paris. General Ironside, the chief of Imperial General Staff, ordered a liaison officer to connect with Gamlin or Georges. Since little information came through, Ironside thought Renault might be overreacting. But Renault soon discovered that the reality was far worse than he had anticipated. Daladier, the war minister, had just learned from Gamelin, who was jolted out of his complacency by news of the Ninth Army's collapse. Reports also indicated that Reinhardt's Panzer Corps had arrived at Montcornet. Later that evening, Renault convened a meeting at the Ministry of the Interior with Daladier and the military governor of Paris to discuss strategies for avoiding panic and maintaining order, especially if the Germans were heading for Paris. The following morning, at 7:30, Churchill received a phone call from Renault. "We have been defeated," Renault exclaimed. Churchill, still groggy, took a moment to respond. Renault stressed, "We are beaten. We've lost the battle." Churchill, taken aback, asked, "Could it really have happened this quickly?" Renault replied, "The front is shattered near Sedan. They're advancing in large numbers with tanks and armored cars." As Renault's foreign affairs advisor, Roland de Margerie, noted, he added, "The road to Paris is open. Send us all the planes and troops you can." Churchill resolved to fly to Paris to bolster Renault's determination, but first, he called a war cabinet meeting to address the request for those 10 additional fighter squadrons. He was resolute in his commitment to assist the French. Air Chief Marshal Dowding, leading Fighter Command, firmly rejected any further aircraft deployments. After an intense discussion, he walked over to Churchill, placing a document in front of him that outlined the expected loss rates based on the current casualties. Within 10 days, there would be no hurricanes remaining in either France or Britain. The War Cabinet acknowledged his points, but still believed another 4 squadrons should be sent to France. They reached another conclusion that day. Bomber Command would finally go on the offensive against German targets, specifically planning a raid on the Ruhr as retaliation for the Luftwaffe's strike on Rotterdam. Although few aircraft hit their intended targets, this signified the first step in the strategic bombing campaign. Worried about the looming possibility of France's defeat, Churchill sent a telegram to President Roosevelt, hoping to prompt him into action on behalf of the Allies. He warned, "As you're likely aware, the situation has worsened quickly. If necessary, we will continue the fight alone, and we are prepared for that. But I hope you understand, Mr. President, that the influence and strength of the United States might become irrelevant if delayed too long. You could witness a swiftly imposed, Nazified Europe, a burden that may become too heavy for us to withstand." Roosevelt's response was cordial, but offered no promise of intervention. Churchill then penned another letter, stressing Britain's resolve to endure to the very end, regardless of the outcome in France, while once again stressing the urgent need for American support. Still sensing that Roosevelt might not grasp the urgency, he hesitated to send yet another message on May 21st. While asserting that his government would never consider surrender, he warned of another peril. If the current administration were to fall and others sought negotiations among the ruins, you must be aware that the only leverage left with Germany would be the fleet. If this nation is abandoned to its fate by the United States, no one could justifiably blame those in charge if they sought the best terms possible for the remaining citizens. Forgive me, Mr. President, for presenting this grim reality so bluntly. I clearly couldn't speak for those who would come after me, who, in their despair and helplessness, might have to submit to the Germans. Churchill did send that signal, but he later recognized that his shocking tactics, suggesting that the Germans could even take control of the Royal Navy's warships to challenge the United States, backfired. This was bound to undermine Roosevelt's trust in Britain's resolve to fight independently, leading the president to discuss with his advisors the possibility of relocating the British fleet to Canada. He even reached out to the Canadian Prime Minister, William Mackenzie King, about this issue. Churchill's blunder would have tragic consequences a few weeks later. On May 16th, in the afternoon, Churchill flew to Paris, unaware that Gamelin had called Renault to inform him that the Germans might invade the capital that very night. They were already closing in on Laon, less than 120 kilometers away. The military governor recommended that the entire administration evacuate immediately. Ministries set files ablaze in their courtyards, with civil servants tossing bundles of papers from windows. Roland de Margerie noted how the wind carried sparks and fragments of paper, which soon blanketed the entire area. He mentioned that Reynaud's defeatist companion, the Comtesse de Port, made a biting remark about the fool who gave this order. The chef de service responded that it was Reynaud himself, but at the last moment, Reynaud decided the government should stay. This decision had little effect, as news had already spread. The people of Paris, kept in the dark about the looming disaster by strict press censorship, quickly fell into panic. The great exodus had begun. Cars piled high with belongings started to pour out through the Porte d'Orléans and the Porte d'Italie. Churchill arrived, along with General Sir John Dill and Major General Hastings Ismay, only to discover that the situation was incomparably worse than we had imagined. At the Quai d'Orsay, they met with Renaud, Daladier, and Gamelin. The mood was so grim that they didn't even take a seat. Utter dejection was written on every face, Churchill would later recall. Gamelin stood by a map on an easel, pointing out a bulge at Sedan while trying to clarify the situation. "Where is the strategic reserve?" Churchill inquired, then repeated in his unique French, "Where is the mobile force?" Gamelin turned to him and, shaking his head and shrugging, responded, "None." Churchill's attention was drawn to the smoke rising outside the building. From the window, he witnessed foreign ministry officials wheeling away stacks of documents to toss onto large bonfires. He was astounded that Gamelin's strategy didn't account for a significant reserve to counter a breakthrough. He was also shocked by his lack of awareness regarding the peril and the dismal state of communication among the Allies. When he directly questioned Gamelin about the plans for counterattacks, the commander-in-chief could only express despair with a shrug. The French army was in dire straits, expecting the British to come to their rescue. Roland de Margerie quietly cautioned Churchill that the situation was even more dire than Daladier or Gamelin had indicated. When he mentioned the possibility of retreating to the River Loire or even continuing the fight from Casablanca, Churchill looked at him in disbelief. Renaud inquired about the 10 fighter squadrons he had requested. With Dowding's warning echoing in his mind, Churchill explained that stripping Britain of its defenses would be catastrophic. He reminded them of the heavy losses the RAF had endured attempting to bomb the Meuse crossings, and assured them that 4 additional squadrons were on the way, while others stationed in Britain were active over France. However, his audience remained far from satisfied. That evening, Churchill sent a message from the British Embassy to the War Cabinet requesting the other 6 squadrons. Once approval was received just before midnight, Churchill visited Reynaud and Daladier to uplift their spirits. Renaud greeted him in a dressing gown and slippers. Ultimately, the extra squadrons had to be stationed back in Britain and fly across daily to engage in combat. With the German advance, there were not enough airfields, and all lacked repair facilities. In total, 120 Hurricanes stationed across the Channel that had been damaged in battle had to be abandoned in the hasty retreat. The pilots were utterly exhausted. Many pilots were flying up to 5 missions a day, and since the French fighters had little chance against the Messerschmitt 109, the Hurricane squadrons faced the overwhelming weight of a lopsided confrontation. Reports of disintegration within the French army and declining discipline began to pile up. In a desperate attempt to maintain order, some officers accused of abandoning their posts were executed to force the troops to stand and fight. Hysteria took hold. Numerous officers and soldiers were randomly shot by panicked troops, convinced they were Germans in Allied uniforms. Waves of panic were triggered by wild rumors of German secret weapons and unfounded fears of a 5th column. Treachery seemed the only explanation for such a bewildering defeat, leading to the outcry. Now some trahi. The chaos escalated as the number of refugees in northeast France surged. Including Dutch and Belgians, around 8 million people were said to have hit the roads that summer, hungry, thirsty, and exhausted. Wealthy individuals in cars, while others traveled in farm carts or pushed loaded bicycles, prams, or hand carts filled with their meager possessions. "They are the most pathetic sight," wrote Lieutenant General Sir Alan Brooke, commander of the BEF's 2 Corps, in his diary, describing the scene of lame women with sore feet, small children worn out from the journey, but still clutching their dolls, and the old and injured struggling along. The fate of Rotterdam had instilled fear in many. The vast majority of Lille's population fled the city as the Germans advanced. Although there's no evidence that the Luftwaffe ordered its fighter pilots to attack refugee columns, members of the Allied forces witnessed such events. The French army, which had depended on a static defense, was even less equipped to respond to the unexpected, with the roads choked by terrified civilians.